Okay, so I have my three favorite presser feet that I use for binding. If you haven't seen my binding tutorial series, I've linked it above here, and there are three parts where I cover the various methods for binding a quilt. Whether you attach to the front first and then pull to the back, or attach to the back first and pull to the front, the way that you attach your binding will be different. And that's where all of these different presser feet come in handy. Now I have a Baby Lock Ballad sewing machine, and one of the things that I love about the Baby Lock Ballad is that they have a digital dual feed walking foot. And this actually has a little belt, if you can see in the middle here, that's different from just a traditional walking foot, that really helps feed everything through, all of the different layers through evenly. And it makes such a difference when I'm quilting or attaching binding on a really thick quilt, for example. You can see that it actually plugs into the machine, so it communicates with the machine recognizes it, and then you can also see there are a few different feet that attach to the dual feed system. This is my favorite because it's open, and I can do decorative stitches on my binding if I like with this, because I can clearly see, and then everything is feeding through and it works perfectly. Now that is something that is specific to the Baby Lock sewing machines that are compatible with the dual feed system. Now the other two feet are Baby Lock presser feet. However, you can use them on any low shank sewing machine. The first one is a stitch in the ditch foot, and you can see that there is a little guide here on the edge that as you sew, it's gliding along the ditch that you're sewing in. In my case, since we're talking about binding, if you're attaching your binding and then you need to stitch in the ditch to finish it, then this is a great presser foot to use. You can see that that little bar, it just glides right along the ditch of your two seams. And then you don't have, which my problem is I'm just all over the place sewing, and I can't sew in a straight line without some sort of a guide. So this is perfect to be able to use in that situation. And then the third one is actually a binding foot. And I like this because look at this, how great. It has a little notch in the bottom of the presser foot so that as you're sewing along with your binding, if you're using a binding technique where you want the stitches showing on the front of your quilt, then this is perfect because it glides along the edge of the binding, and then your needle is sitting just in the perfect position of where you would want your stitches showing on the front of your quilt. And then also it helps you keep everything in line so you're not zigzagging off of that binding edge. And as I mentioned, it has that little notch. If you can see that, get that a little closer for you. It has the little notch, so it just glides along the binding, and it's just perfect. So as I mentioned, these 2 feet are specific to my Baby Lock machine, but you can actually use them on any low shank machine. Okay, so I have one of my quilts that I needed to bind. This is my lemon squared quilt with some beautiful Rifle Paper Company fabrics from their Primavera line, which is my binding as well, and then also some Moda solids as well. So I have already attached my binding to the back of my quilt, as you can see, and I pull that to the front, and then I like to glue baste that down. If you, again, need some more binding tips and want to see my full process, then I've linked those videos above and you can check that out. So I have glue basted, and you can see I have my first presser foot down, which is the binding foot. And remember, I showed you that little notch underneath that is just going to run along the edge of the binding here. Okay, I've positioned that better so that you can see. And again, it's going to run just along here where the binding is. I'll start my stitching here. When we attach to the back and pull to the front, we want that stitch line to end up being about 1/8 of an inch from the edge there. And that's why I like this binding foot, because you can see that there's a notch here as well for us to keep a visual eye, but underneath is where that raised edge is. So it's actually just gliding along the edge of the binding. So all we have to really do is sew and make sure that we're not letting that deviate from that particular area. And you just let the foot do the work. But I'm going to go ahead and finish this with this binding foot, and then I will show you the final results. And then I also want to show you what it looks like when I use the other two of my favorite binding feet. Okay, so here is the first quilt that I have finished. This is my lemon squared quilt pattern that I mentioned in Rifle Paper Company and Moda Solids. Look how beautiful that is. And you can see my binding, how beautiful, nice and straight across. On the back, you can't even see the threads. And then on the front with the binding foot, it just turned out great. So that's the first foot that I wanted to show you. So let's take a look at the second. For the next presser foot that I am going to show you, I have this beautiful Christmas quilt with my cinnamon spice quilt pattern that I need to bind. It has been long armed by Debbie at Spare Threads, and I have already, as you can see, I decided to attach my binding to the front of this quilt, and I have pressed and folded it to the back and glue basted it to the back. I also want to show you this back. Look at the quilting, how beautiful on this. It is gorgeous. And the presser foot that I'm going to show you with this one is this stitch in the ditch foot. So what I have done, because I will be stitching in the ditch on the front and catching the back of the binding, you want to make sure that your bobbin thread matches whatever you want on the back, and then your top thread will be what you stitch in the ditch with. Hopefully, if you're stitching in the ditch well, then you won't be able to see that thread, but just in case, I do like to pick one that is going to match with the top. I decided, as you can see, may be able to see, I've just decided to go with a white thread for my top, and then I chose a nice red to go on the back. Even though my thread on the back of the quilting is a lighter color, I thought that the red would be a nice blend. With a busy binding like this, you won't see it as much as if you had something that was solid or less busy, but I still try to be very mindful of that. So just remember, if you're doing this method where you're stitching in the ditch, top thread will be the top of your quilt, and your bobbin thread is what will be showing on the bottom. So I have that all set up, and I have my foot already attached on my Baby Lock Ballad, and we are ready to start stitching in the ditch to attach this binding. All right, so we are up close and personal with my presser foot and my quilt, and I wanted to be able to show you that this binding foot, again, this is a Baby Lock specific binding foot, but it does also fit on other low shank machines. But this little guide will just fall right in the ditch or the seam on our binding. So I'm not really paying attention to where my needle is going up and down, but I want to keep my eye on where this guide is and making sure that it stays in the ditch of my seam here. And that's what will ensure that your thread won't show on the top of your binding. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. And what I like to do is put my needle down and my presser foot and make sure it's in a great spot first. Go ahead and secure my stitch, and then I'll just start feeding that through. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to make sure that this guide stays in the seam. And it's so much easier to not have to worry about eyeballing where your needle is going. All you have to do is watch that guide. So the foot is really doing the work for us. And then, as I mentioned, I glue basted my binding down, which is nice so that then I don't have to worry about not catching the back of my binding as I'm sewing. So that's one less thing to worry about as well. And I like to take my time, even though I am confident using this foot, I still go slower than I do with my regular sewing, because if you start to veer off a little bit, maybe because of a bulky seam, then you are really going to be able to see that outlier of thread when you come off of the ditch. Okay, so I'm going to stop and then go ahead and show you. I think I've stitched enough so that I can pull this around and show you what this looks like. Let me do a little bit more so that I can pull this around to show you. Okay, I think that's enough. So when I pull my quilt back here, you can see there's that red thread, and it is a nice, consistent place away from the edge of my binding. And then on the front, as you can see, you can't see my thread that's inside that ditch. Now, if we look really super closely, let me zoom in, you can see those threads right through there. But without pulling it back, if we're just looking at the quilt in general, you can't see those threads. And that is what the goal is of this foot, that the thread line is just on the inside of that. And you can see that here because I'm pulling the fabric away a little bit and I've got you up close on the camera. But if we were just looking at our quilt, you can't see that at all. So that's what the goal is. And as I mentioned, this presser foot is really doing the work for me. And this is not just for binding. You can use this stitch in the ditch foot for any number of things, anytime that you need to sew in the ditch or your seams, so to speak. But the little guide makes so much of a difference. So let me go ahead and finish this up with this foot, and then I'll show you the final results. And here is our finished second quilt, which is the Cinnamon Spice quilt. And again, we used the stitch in the ditch foot. You can see on the back of our quilt, you can see the stitching, but then on the front where we stitched in the ditch, you can't see that at all. That stitch in the ditch foot really made a difference in getting that nice, finished, clean look on both sides of the quilt. Okay, and the third quilt that we are going to work on with our binding feet is my Sugar Coated Stars quilt pattern. Again, it is a Christmas quilt that I made last year and have not binded. You can see I've got this beautiful motif fabric with motor grunge on the back. I have already attached my binding to the back and I have glue basted it to the front. What I want to do is I have this beautiful green, it's almost a army green type color that you can see matches with some of the different shades of green within the fabric collection, and then also within the binding as well. And I want to do a decorative stitch on here. I thought it would be a really pretty touch. I do not like to hand quilt on my binding, but I thought it would be a really fun addition to this quilt that seems more toned down in some areas. And then, as I mentioned, the fabric and then the binding really allows it to pop. So I thought that decorative binding stitch would be a great addition too. So let's head over to my sewing machine. I am going to use my digital dual feed foot with my baby lock, and I'm going to show you how I use it for this decorative stitching. Here we are at the panel on my Baby Lock Ballad, and I've already attached my digital dual feed foot to my machine. As I mentioned before, it actually plugs into the machine. So you can see here where it says DF that it is recognizing that I have my dual feed foot on the machine. And then I can go through here and pick any decorative stitch that I like. I have used a lot of these before on binding in some of my videos, so you can go back on the blog and check those out. Because this Christmas quilt is a little bit more organic, we have leaves and holly berries and leaves that are in not only the fabric, but in the quilting as well. I noticed this leaf pattern that I really like a lot that I think would be really pretty on the binding. And you can see the preview here. One thing that I like to do with my binding as well is increase the stitch length. So I'm going to see how that looks in this preview as well to make sure that it's something that I want to be able to use in binding. And then before I get started, it's always a good idea to stitch out a sample of that pattern that you've picked out to make sure that it fits in the binding well and it looks good for the size and reference on your binding itself. We wouldn't want something that would be too large for a small piece of binding. Okay, so here we are at my foot. I already have my thread in here ready to go. I'm just using a light cream on the back since I'm matching that light cream Moda Grunge on the back as well. And I have my little test piece of binding. This is a piece of binding that I cut off of the edge when I finished, and I'm going to just go ahead and fold this in half. Now remember, your binding does have the quilt inside, so it's not exactly in half. It's a good way just to practice the scale of your binding, and then I'm going to compare that to the binding on my quilt and I'll be able to get a better look at it. So I'm just going to stitch a little sample out that we can look at before we start stitching this along all of our quilt, because we would not want to start something and not like it or have the scale be off and then we have to rip it out before we start anything. And let's take a look at this sample. Now with this green thread, you can see that I do lose a little bit of the detail that these are leaves. It does look really pretty on the back with the white thread, but I don't want to use a white thread. Obviously on this binding, it's way too bright. But on the green, it is very pretty, and I'll have to think on that. But I think let's look at the quilt itself and take a look at how that might look on my quilt. Okay, so I have my quilt here, and then as I mentioned, that binding that I was doing is not quite the same size, but it is almost, and it's a good reference point. So as you can see, if I just lay this down, it gives me a better visualization of what this decorative stitching may look like on my binding. But I really do like the way that that looks on the binding. I think it gives it a really nice touch to the binding. As I mentioned, you can see the overall feel of the leaves a little bit better now that I'm putting it against the quilt. And I really do like this. And I think this is a good size as well. So I am comfortable and ready to go ahead and start stitching on my binding. Okay, I've zoomed in a little closer for you to be able to see how I've lined this up. And as I mentioned, I was happy with everything, so I didn't need to make any other adjustments. The only thing I'm going to pay attention to is where I want this centered on the actual binding. And you can actually see that I've got the two red lines that line up with my binding anyway. So I'm just going to keep an eye on those areas to make sure that I don't veer too off from either of those red lines. All right, and I'm just going to use a lock stitch there first, and then I am going to go slow just in case I don't like something that I can easily stop and take out and readjust if I need to. I'm going to do a little bit more until I get to an area where I can show you this, but this is turning out really great. And then as I feel comfortable, I can speed up, just keeping an eye on those two red lines. And remember also, when you're doing a decorative stitch like this, you're not feeding through and guiding your binding through as you would if you were doing a straight stitch. So we don't want to be pushing this through. I'm really just guiding it along and making sure that it stays in the right place. All right, so let's take a look at this. I have stitched enough that I think that you can see, and this is absolutely darling. I love how this is turning out. You can see that lining up those lines on my foot with the binding is making sure that this decorative stitch is right here in the middle. And one of the reasons that I love the digital dual feed for something like this is that it can handle the thickness of my quilt and my binding, and I really don't have to do a lot of work to get the quilt feeding through. I'm actually just simply guiding it through, making sure that my lines are staying aligned with my binding. And that belt and the digital feed system is making sure that everything feeds through evenly. So I am going to finish up this binding. It does take a little bit longer, have to be patient, but it will definitely be worth the wait. So let me finish it up and then I'll show you the final results. Okay, so I am all finished with this third quilt and I wanted to show you, look at this binding, how adorable this decorative binding. And as I mentioned, it's the white on the back, which really blends in with the background. So, or the backing fabric. So I'm not worried about what it looks like as much on the binding because looking at it overall, I think it looks great. And then on the front, it really blends in, but then just adds that personal touch to this quilt. And as I mentioned, this is just such a beautiful fabric and the background really looks great with the quilting. And I think that the decorative stitching was really the way to go with this quilt. I really hope that you enjoyed our video on my 3 favorite feet for binding a quilt top, sponsored by Baby Lock Sewing. and Sugar Stitches Quilt Co. So again, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it was helpful to you. Have fun binding your quilts. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.